Hello, welcome to Eyes Wide Open with me, your host, Lawrence Eastman. Today's guest is Jerry Marzinsky. Jerry has over 35 years experience as a psychologist with a degree in psychology, a master's in counseling, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. Jerry is now retired, but spent most of his career in the Arizona State Hospital and the Arizona State Prison. During that time, Jerry studied the thought processes and voices of psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in America. Since retirement, Jerry has co-authored a book called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. The book charts Jerry's extraordinary experience working with paranoid schizophrenics and what the voices in their head really mean. So, Jerry Marzinsky, welcome to the show. It's a real honor to have you on here today, Jerry. As we talked about in your introduction, you've got vast experience in the prison system and the mental hospital institutions. Can you give us a little brief introduction to your background as a psychotherapist working in these institutions and the type of places that you worked in and how you got into such a line of work?
Well, to give you a little bit of background, I was a licensed psychotherapist for over 35 years, closer to 40 at this point. And I've been studying the thought processes of psychotics and the criminally insane now for most of my career. The psychology and psychiatry did a good job of describing what these disorders were. But one thing that stuck out when I was in school was they didn't have any solutions. They had a very detailed descriptions of what these things were and all this theoretical stuff of what caused it, but they didn't have any solutions. So that always puzzled me. It's like, what causes mental illness? So I started off working in one of the biggest, if not the biggest, psychiatric hospital on the planet, Central State Hospital in Georgia at the time. And it was the size of a small city. I mean, here's these massive brick buildings with, windows there and locked wards and bars in front of the windows. And I remember at night, I went out walking when I first got there, and you can hear the screams of the mentally ill just echo off into the night. And I remember standing in front of one psychiatric unit, and I'm looking up in the window, and here's this old lady just appears, and all I could see is her shadow in the window. And she's looking down at me, and I'm looking up at her, and I'm wondering about what she's thinking, and she's probably wondering what I'm doing out there in the dark, staring up at her at the window. But I'll never forget that image when I first saw that. But when I first got to Central State, there were close to 10,000 patients there. Every form of mental illness that you could ever imagine was in there. And for me, it was like I was fascinated with mental illness. I mean, it started with my first abnormal psychology course, and it just went from there. So I was like a kid in a candy store.
What do you think? What do you think drew you to that specific area of psychology? Why was it like a candy store to you?
Well, I think like most psychologists, it was like trying to straighten out my own head. I came from a very violent and dysfunctional family, which was probably the best training I could have ever had for working in these institutions. Yeah, because it's like after dealing with my father, it was like deal with some of these psychotic guys and go, yeah, what else you got, buddy? So I couldn't have had any better training for that than the family background I came up with, which was fairly dysfunctional. So trying to straighten out my own head. And then it's like hit abnormal. And it's like, this happened to all of us studying abnormal psychology. It was like, oh, I got that in me. And then you move to the next one. It's yeah, I got that too. And I got that too. And I got, it's all these different things. And we're all sitting there going, well, we got all these things, to different degrees. So it's a continuum. It's not like psychiatry says, well, between here and here. I mean, it's a continuum. It's like the human continuum, and they just break these things up into different segments and say this is this and this is that and this is this. They make a name for it. They give it a label. They give it a number so they can charge the insurance companies, and they hereby declare it a mental illness. So some of the mental illnesses they've had.
Is this to do with the DSM?
Yes.
And how psychiatry creates new conditions by consensus during a vote. And then it's entered into the DSM, and that's then called, mental illness.
Yep, they make them up. There is not a single clinical test for any of these mental illnesses that they've come up with. And they started with 3 or 4. I mean, dementia precox, which, schizophrenia was one of the first ones. And then they just slowly made them up one after another. And then in the late, what was it? I think probably in the 30s, the Standard Oil guy and Rothschilds and some of these others, Rockefeller. Yeah, they came up and they went, okay, any medical school that's teaching anything other than pharmacological medicine will not be licensed. And they had all the money in the strings. So here they put out of business all these other therapies that were going on at the time, electrotherapy, naturopathy, all these other forms of therapy, and said the only legitimate one are the ones that are have pharmacological background kind of thing. So they virtually hijacked
the formation of the FDA. Was it the FDA that issued the licenses for the pharmacological practices?
Well, the FDA is for the drugs. The Flexner report. So they fabricated this report, paid off a bunch of senators and congressmen to vote on it. Here it is. Okay, the Flexner report. It was pushed through in 1910. It was pushed through Congress by the Rockefellers and the Carnegie Foundation. And the Rockefeller Group sponsored the infamous Flexner Report, which shut down any medical school teaching subjects outside of mainstream pharmacology. So at that point, they actually hijacked the medical system. The edict was so powerful that only a few medical schools survived, like Johns Hopkins and McGill and a handful of others connected with these groups. They were the only schools who could legally license doctors. And doctors who practice any method outside of pharmacology were threatened with the loss of their licenses. So, stuff that was coming out at the time, like Tesla's violet ray that was proliferating about that time and used for all kinds of treatments, were shot down. Anything other than drugs. People who worked with other kind of stuff, naturopaths, electromedicine, any other kind of medicine, were considered quacks. So here's these, the deep state had hijacked the medical system at that time.
When did you discover this as a newly qualified psychotherapist? When did you start to realize the fraud of psychiatry and the hoax it's playing against unsuspecting victims?
Well, it started in undergraduate school, where I started getting inklings of it. Okay. And again, because of the way I was raised, I never trusted authority. I never trusted authority. So here I am going through undergraduate psychology at Temple University. And it was pretty intense. And one thing that bothered me about it is the only psych course that I could verify was experimental psychology, where you could actually go into the lab, run these procedures, and watch the behavioral mechanisms roll off reliably. All these others, you had to take their word for it. So here you are reading all this stuff, and then you go to the back of the book, and this struck me as odd too. You go to the back and you look at the references. And this guy got the information from this guy, who got the information from this guy, who got it from this guy, who got it from this guy. And, in the entire time, close to 40 years that I've been working on the front lines of psychology and psychiatry, I have never seen a researcher, any kind of researcher, come onto the front lines looking for answers. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't let them in. They'd say, oh, it's too dangerous, or you only can do this kind of stuff, or in the prison they wouldn't let any researcher in. I never saw a researcher at the state hospital. They had students coming through, but it's almost like before they would let you into these institutions, they had to make sure that you were brainwashed to their way of thinking. This is caused by this. This is what this is. Da, 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 and what is it? You learn it and you regurgitate it. Things started breaking down. I remember one time where one of the courses in abnormal psych we had, where the psychologist had us read a research report that says that if two crazy people met each other and they both had the same delusion, one of them would have to give way. And I'm like, what? Why would that be? You got two crazy people, and why would one of them have to give way to the delusion of the other one? And it just stuck in my head, but I had no way to verify any of this stuff that they were teaching us. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. So I logged it away. And probably 20, 25 years later, I was on the second floor of one of the psych units. And here's this old guy walking around. I hadn't seen him before. And he's carrying on a conversation with somebody. It looked like he was talking to himself. But, I kind of crept up behind him and listened to him. It was like hearing a one-way telephone conversation where you only could hear the guy talking. But you could hear the responses, and the talk was to these responses. So I found that interesting. And I walked up to him and he spotted me. And I said, hey, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. You're new. I haven't seen you before. And I go, what's your name? And he goes, I'm Jesus Christ. And I looked at him and I'm like, click, click, click. I went, no. You're not Jesus Christ, because I'm Jesus Christ. And I sat there waiting like, okay, what's he going to do? So he's thinking about it. And then he looks at me and goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And then he just strolls off. I went, well, okay, so much for that BS, Mm-hmm. And then I checked into later on, this was years later, I checked into the validity of the research that psychologists do. Virtually higher than 85% was non-replicable. So in short order, it was crap. It could not be replicated.
You couldn't repeat it.
And I saw that while it couldn't be repeated. And I saw that when I was in the doctoral program. It was like, yeah, publish. It doesn't matter what you publish as long as you publish.
If a lot of these conditions are created by psychiatrists and psychiatry in order to put them in the DSM so that big pharma can create new psychotropic drugs in order to treat these conditions that were just created, I mean, is mental illness a fraud? I mean, how do they diagnose paranoid schizophrenics who are real?
They are real. They have all these. It's not that the mental illness isn't real. I mean, it's a part of the human continuum. Mm-hmm. And we all have facets of paranoid schizophrenia.
Like a spectrum.
It's a spectrum. Yeah. And these entities, I mean, that drive it, they hit us all. So, it starts out with, where do thoughts come from? Yeah. Are they yours? And Manuel Swedenborg some 300 years ago says, no, none of your thoughts are your own. Now you're not born with thoughts. They didn't come with you when you were born. But all of us have this voice in our head that's constantly ba 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 ba, and so do schizophrenics. Mm-hmm. The difference is the intent. What is that voice in your head? Who is that voice in your head? And if you think that's you, then who's listening? Who's the one that's listening to that constant gibberish that's going on in your head? And how much of that gibberish is true? Not much of it.
In terms of paranoid schizophrenics, what differentiates them from, the general public who hear voices in their heads, but it's their own voice? How do they know the difference? Between how does psychiatry say you're mad, you're going to get locked up indefinitely because you're mad?
Yeah, they have a list of traits. They call the voices hallucinations. All right.
So paranoid schizophrenic is defined by people who hear voices in their head.
Well, that's one of the symptoms. That's one of the main characteristics. There's a withdrawal from everybody. There's irrational behavior, irrational thoughts, the self-destructive behavior, suicidal ideation, doing crazy things, saying crazy things, saying stuff that doesn't make sense, talking to themselves or carrying on conversations with voices. They have a whole listing of traits for each of these mental disorders. But they appear in everybody, but they're in a higher concentration in schizophrenics. So what's key is that people believe and are taught from the time they're born that their thoughts are their own. They're not. They come from other places. They come from dark places. They come from good places. But what you have in your head is a story about yourself that you've concocted, and it's a series of experiences that you've had in your entire life, and that voice in your head is constantly reinforcing that. So when you see something that happens in the environment, you'll grab that and okay, that supports my idea of who I am and what's going on. So each of us have our own stories. They're different. Where things got strange was when I was at the state hospital.
It's just the early part of your career.
The early part of my career.
And was you specializing in paranoid schizophrenics, or was you seeing all kinds of different people?
No, I just kept, it's like some big hand every time I tried to escape them because they were very frustrating. They were very aggravating. They were very perplexing. They were very abusive. They were not good people. They were really squirrely, and it was like, what the devil is going on with these people? It's like, so it was like bit by bit, little piece by piece. I would get a piece here, a piece there. One of the first things I had to do was figure out how to talk to them. And what happened is if they thought that you believed, like all the other psychologists and psychiatrists did, that their voices were hallucinations, they wouldn't tell you anything.
So that's the standard explanation of psychiatry for voices in the heads of paranoid schizophrenics, that they're just hallucinations created by their own mind.
Right. Yeah. So due to a chemical brain imbalance, which they've never been able to prove. Matter of fact, it's been disproved. Yeah. And when the research started coming out, they tried to hide it. The chemical companies, the big pharma tried to hide it. They wouldn't publish it in their journals. They wouldn't let it get out in any of the professional journals, especially with the antipsychotic meds, which are very toxic. They're they're some of the most dangerous meds used in medicine today. These antipsychotic meds will shrink your brain. They destroy your peripheral nervous system. They cause all kinds of neurological damage. And when that first came out in research, they found it with long-term schizophrenics, like in mental hospitals. They would do autopsies on them, and they found that all their brains were shrunk, like walnuts. They just shrunk. So when they published this, all of a sudden the drug companies and psychiatry comes running out screaming, it's not the meds, it's not the meds, it's the schizophrenia, whatever that is. It's the schizophrenia germ. It's the schizophrenia disease, and it's neither a disease or a germ.
Is this the way that psychiatrists have learned how to handle paranoid schizophrenics, in the sense that psychiatrists going back 100 years or more have been the people who deal with the crazy schizophrenics on a day-to-day basis, and they've used a multitude of cruel and unusual punishments in order to control people who have this affliction, from torture to torment and straitjackets. And it seems as if these psychotic drugs that they have now are just used as a weapon to silence them, throw them in a corner, and not have to worry about them. Is that what you'd say is going on?
That's pretty much it. I mean, now, not to say that the antipsychotic drugs that they have work only because they calm the person down. Yeah. And that's the only reason. There is no chemical imbalance in their brains. They've never found one. Matter of fact, they've disproven it over and over again. Yeah. There's no schizophrenia gene, so it's not genetic. but they have to give the appearance that they know what's going on. So,
do you think that they really do know what's going on?
No.
This is the cover
they have no
story.
idea. They have no idea what's going on. None.
Yeah.
But they act like that. I mean, their egos are just blown all out of proportion. But they're just drug pushers for the friggin' pharma companies.
Yeah.
And their suicide rate is virtually exactly the same as that of schizophrenics, which is 3 to 5 times higher than the general population.
What, psychiatrists?
Psychiatrists.
Okay.
But isn't that interesting?
What do you think that is? That's
interesting.
I think is it stress of the job, or is it the knowing the fraud that they're committing against people, the crimes that maybe they're involved in?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. Is one is they know that these medications that they're dishing out are potentially harming a lot of their patients. They're not curing anybody. These people keep coming back over and over, and that's how the modern day mental hospitals work. They bring them in, they fill them full of these antipsychotic drugs, which are awful with terrible side effects. I mean, terrible side effects. The voices are ameliorated; they're kind of lessened. It doesn't make them go away, and if it does, as soon as they stop taking the drugs, the voices come back. So they don't cure anything. So eventually, almost all of them go off those drugs, and that was one of the things I wondered about at the state hospital too. I mean, we had I was working in a psych rehab center. It was a Yarborough Psychiatric Rehab Center, and we had vocational classes for all these people. They were kind of auto mechanics and janitor and hairdresser and that kind of stuff. They had to go for 6 months, I think, on a job before we considered them a success. But what would happen is, and this is true for almost all schizophrenics, as they started to get to the point where they succeeded, where they were about to get their certificates, they did something to screw it up. They would sabotage themselves, and it was time after time after time. And one of the most common things they would do, they go off their medications. And I'm going, why are they doing that? So I knew the side effects were awful. So, and I also knew in my gut that the schizophrenics had the answers. Psychiatry didn't have any answers. So it was kind of like, okay, the side effects are awful, but what's worst? Being psychotic, which you go down the list of all these, hallucinations where you see monsters coming out of the wall, or the walls bleed blood, and you're afraid that the police are after you, or somebody's going to murder you, or somebody's looking in the window, or somebody's following you. And I mean, it's just hell on earth. I mean, it's bad. It's really bad. Your mind is taken over with paranoia about everything. You don't know what's real, what's not real. It's like hell on earth. Now, the side effects of the medications are bad. So it's like, okay, which is worse? So every patient who went off their meds, when I had my caseload at the hospital, I'd give them a couple of questionnaires. I'd go, okay, what were the side effects of the antipsychotic drugs you were taking? I'd write them down. Okay, so they wrote them down because they all didn't have the same side effects. So there'd be a handful of side effects, and they were bad stuff. Sexual dysfunction. My brain was foggy. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't see straight. My vision was blurred. I had nervous tics, dry mouth, all this whole list of, but not all of them had all those side effects. And then I'd say, okay, write down. I give them a list of all the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, which is about a page and a half out of the DSM. And I said, okay, circle each one of these you've had while you're off your meds. And so they would do that. And then I'd take them, I'd look at them both, and I'd give them back to them. And I'd say, which one is worse? Okay, so which one of these two bad things was the worst? 100% said the psychotic symptoms were much worse. And then was a $64 question. Then why do you keep going off your meds? So what they would say before that, and what all the other staff would say, well, it's due to the side effects. So now they had the comparison between the side effects and the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. And here they're saying the symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia are much worse. My question to them is, then why do you keep going off your meds? You know what their answer was? I don't know. That went on for all 7 years. Every time one of them went off their meds, I would ask them, why'd you do it? And I felt like I was going nuts myself. It's like, you know, you keep asking the same question, you keep getting the same answer. There's no change. And I'm like, but they have to know the answer at some point. So toward the end of the 7 years, there was one gal that was doing really well. She was about to graduate. She went off her meds, sabotaged herself, and we were about to throw her out because that was the third time she'd done it. So we figured, okay, if they can't stay on their meds, they're not going to be able to work, which is pretty much true. And if they can't stay on them here, they're not going to stay on them out in the community. They're not going to make the trouble to go get them and take them, and you know, because their meds are awful. So the mother calls me up and she goes, "You can't send her home. I can't handle her. I don't know what to do. You got to keep her there. We got to let me come up there and talk to her. Maybe we can talk her some sense into her." And I said, "Okay, well, you know, come on up." And it was one Friday afternoon. The mother and I were in my office. We brought her in. And both of us are asking the patient, you know, you're doing well in your classes. You were making good grades. This is the third time you did this, went off your meds, and you blew you got kicked out of class. You couldn't function. You were back there making noises and talking to hallucinations or whatever, you know. And the mother's begging her, like, why'd you do this? Why? And I'm like, yeah, why did you do this? Why? And she goes, you won't believe it. I said, well, you know, I've seen some pretty strange stuff since I've been here. I don't think you're going to tell me anything that's going to shock me. I said, well, why do you keep going off your meds? And she said, well, the voices told me to. They told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me with those meds and that I needed to go off them. Now, something else clicked. Remember, we talked about the assaults on the psychiatrist earlier?
Yeah.
Well, if the voices are telling the patients that the psychiatrists are poisoning them with these meds, then it makes sense that if the psychiatry is forcing them to take these meds, they're going to lash out against the psychiatrist for poisoning.
The meds in this situation were quietening the voices in the heads of the patients.
What they are is major tranquilizers. They're major tranquilizers.
Yeah. So why did the voices want the patient to stop taking the meds so that they had more control over the host?
Exactly right. Yeah. You know, because they lose ground like that. So one thing these voices do is they're constantly pushing for more and more control. You know, and the arguments that you see between schizophrenics, I mean, you go to a mental hospital and you'll hear them just carrying on these volatile arguments with somebody, you know, calling them names, you son of a bitch, no, I'm not going to do that, you know, get out of my head, They're trying to gain more and more control. So, and they're telling the patient themselves, don't tell anybody about us, because if you do, they're not going to believe you. You know, they're going to take you to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist is going to fill you with drugs, and then they're going to lock you up. Unfortunately, that's what happens.
Do you think there's a lot of people in mental institutions that shouldn't be there? I mean, they're there just because, you know, it's the only way that society knows how to deal with them, but it's just making their life worse. It's more torment and torture on behalf of the patient. I mean, what was your experience in the hospital with dealing with all these patients? I mean, that must have been pretty tough work.
Well, yeah, to tell you the truth, at least they had a place to stay. So when Proposition 13 came through here in the United States from California, it was a tax rebellion back in the 70s where the Californians are going, you're taxing us to death, and we're sick of it, and you know, no more. You know, so they cut it out. So they started chopping off their state hospitals, and then making up this bullcrap that, oh, these guys will be better off in a normal population out on the street with somebody else taking care of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to uptick the mental health centers, fund them better, and they can get their meds from the mental health center. But they weren't even taking them in the state hospitals where they were being handed to them. They're not going to go out of their way to go to a mental health center and try to find transportation. Most of them don't have transportation to go to a mental health center. And then they have these things dished out, and they're just going to give them a month's prescription. They're not going to take these things. So now you got the streets of San Francisco and all these other major cities filled with mentally ill people. They're the people that are on the sidewalks sleeping out in the gutters and stuff. Those are the people who were in the state hospitals.
We had something like that in the UK. Is that Margaret Thatcher, when she was Prime Minister, she brought in something similar, which was called care in the community, where she'd empty all the asylums, empty the hospitals, and the people who needed the care and attention from the medical institutions were just thrown out onto the street, and they become a lot of the homeless.
It happened in the whole Western world. So it's like, okay, this will be cheaper, but it's not cheaper, because the ones who were dangerous ended up in the state prison. So the state prisons and your prisons are now the state hospitals where they used to be. And the cost of keeping a mentally ill guy in the prisons is much higher than it was in the state hospital, because you have to have the security, you have to watch them closer. You have to, it's much higher. The cost is much higher. And then you have all these crazy guys in the prisons where they don't give them any psychotic meds there unless they're causing problems.
Right.
So what the gangsters are doing there is they're taking the meds from some of these guys, and they're telling them, hey, this guy in this rival gang he's going to kill you. He's after you. You better go get him first. They give him a weapon. They say, yeah, here, go get that guy. So the crazy guy goes over and stabs the guy, and he's like their torpedo.
Wow.
So these guys get more upset, more hardened, more violent in the prisons. And then when their term runs out, they give them 2 weeks worth of antipsychotic meds, throw them out on the street with $50, and say, when you run out of meds, go to the nearest emergency room, which is where I spent the last 10 years of my career, working psych crisis in the emergency rooms. So here's these guys the prisons are sending in, hey, I'm out of my meds. The voices are telling me to kill myself. What do I do? So it's like, okay, so now you have to hook them up with the mental health center. You hook them up with the mental health center. They give them the meds. They go off the meds. The same thing happens, and this whole giant merry-go-round just keeps spinning and spinning around and around. They go off their meds. They put them on their meds. They psychiatrically hospitalize them. They charge the insurance companies tens of thousands of dollars for all this, for the drugs, for the hospitalization. They kick them out, and it just goes round and round. It's like the giant fleecing of society by
do you think it's just money? Do you think
it's mostly money?
There's no higher agenda going on in terms of like creating chaos within society and all those things to destabilize our civilization,
Well, it does do that. It does do that. I'm not sure they're doing that on purpose, but it is happening. I've seen them release people from the state prison that I knew within 6 months they were going to kill somebody. That's how bad off they were, but their sentence over. And then on top of that, so they're releasing these guys every day, scores of them every day. They're releasing out into the community. But if one guy escapes from the prison who's a robber or murderer or something, and they announce it on the news, oh, there's a murderer loose in the neighborhood. Everybody close their doors and get your guns out, and everybody's panicking and like, oh, did they catch him yet? Did they catch him yet? They're totally unaware that they're letting scores of them out every day into the community, and in worse shape than they ever went in. There is virtually no rehabilitation in the prisons at all. Virtually none.
It's just punishment, isn't it?
It's punishment. And Skinner showed 80 years ago that punishment doesn't work. It just suppresses the behavior below baseline as long as that punishing stimulus is there. So as long as you got the cop with the club over your head, you're going to behave. But as soon as he goes away, what happens is the behavior swings up past baseline higher as if to catch up with the time lost, and then goes back down to baseline again. So punishment does not work. Scientifically, it does not work. And our institutions, that's what they're doing. It's
Do you
more
think
like
these
a
guys as well,
thing.
once they're released, they're so institutionalized. The only place that they think they can have any structure, order, or control over what's going on in their head is back in prison or mental hospital. And so they go and commit a crime in order for their voices to be able to go and endure this torture, torment, pain, and suffering.
I've heard that many times. They come out, they've been there 10 years, and here's cell phones. And what's a cell phone? And what's all this new stuff? And what is this car? And what, they run on electricity? And, it's like they're not, they've been out of it. It's like you've been on a desert island for 10 years, and they can watch some television in there, but it's like they're totally not suited. And all the rehabilitation programs, they've slowly destroyed them. I mean, they used to give them training, Okay, let's become a gardener, or become a cosmetologist, or become a carpenter. And they'd have these classes in there. But slowly they've taken them, time after time, because the states are they have this, mandatory sentencing laws here. They had it for marijuana for a long time. You get caught with a, half ounce of marijuana, you're going to prison for this much time, and they throwing these guys in there, and the prisons are full to overflowing. They're full to overflowing. There's no room in there. The rooms that were designed for 2 people, they got 4 people in there. They're overcrowded to the max, and there's virtually no rehabilitation going on in there at all. So they're a plague on society, if anything. Yeah. The only people that should be in there are the violent ones that they can't control. That
danger to society.
Danger to society.
So okay, we've gone off a little bit in terms to politics, really, and the politics of prisons and stuff like that. But let's move it back towards schizophrenics that you were dealing with in the hospital, and the discoveries you began to make into the voices, and what you were uncovering with that research, and how you were dealing with it.
Well, the first thing I noticed when I got to the state hospital was nobody was curious about what these voices were telling these people. They knew that the voices were driving their behavior. They could see it. They could see them arguing with them. They could say the voices are telling me to kill myself. I mean, they could see it. They could see that these voices were driving their behavior, but not a single one of them was interested in what these voices were telling these people. So I started asking them, well, what are the voices? What are they telling you? And what do you think they are? And if they sensed that I thought they were hallucinations, if they would just shut up. They wouldn't tell me anything. So at one point when I realized that, I said, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. It's their heads. Let's find out what's going on in their heads. And I started asking them questions about the voices, and one guy'd tell me a little thing here and another one there, and I'd collect up all these little things that they're telling me about the voices. And when I got the next guy, I'd say, well, I know this and this and this about the voices. What else can you tell me? So here comes this series of things that I would check out with each different schizophrenic. So if one schizophrenic told me, well, the voices tell me this, then I'd ask the next in line, do you also hear this? And then patterns started emerging, which was really interesting because hallucinations don't have patterns. They're random.
So what were the patterns? I mean, what was it that kept reoccurring in order for you to, your attention to be piqued enough to start asking deep questions?
Now this is after 40 years of studying the voices. So here are the patterns that these voices run, and this is after pretty much 40 years in the field. They're negative. They're always negative. They're not positive. They're always telling the guy something bad about himself or somebody else. That's their most common, consistent trait. They're derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. They may try to convince the person that they're positive helpers, that they're trying to help them out. Sometimes they'll say, we're Jesus, or we're spirits, we have powers that we can help you with. But invariably, they're trying to get the person's trust that they are somebody that can help them or they're a friend, and then they slowly turn on them. They're anti-religious. I noticed that in the state hospital right away. It came to apparent one day when I noticed that when the chaplain was having ice cream socials, all the schizophrenics on my ward stayed on the ward. They didn't go down to the ice cream social. Cake and ice cream were hard to come by in that place. So I'd ask them, well, why aren't you down with the other guys with the chaplain, the ice cream? So I don't like chaplains. I don't like the Bible. There is no God. And the ones I started asking questions about that, and asked them, well, have you ever gone to church? And they go, yeah. Well, what did the voices do when you went to church? Well, it broke down into 3 categories. If the voices were weak, when they went to church, the voices would shut up. If they were medium strength, and they went in there and the preacher started talking, the voices would get louder and drown them out. So the person couldn't hear what the voices were saying. And they'd say stuff like, Jesus couldn't even help himself. What makes you think he's going to help you? This is stuff that the voices are commonly telling these people. Oh, this is a bunch of crap. One of the biggest tricks they do is if you read the Bible, the voices will tell them, well, you got to read it from cover to cover. And then when they get to the point where this guy begat that guy, begat that guy, begat, and that goes on for pages and pages, the voices come back and go, see, it's a bunch of crap. Why are you wasting your time with that? Look at this crap. But if the voices are real strong and the guy tries to go in, they'll jump up and they'll run out of that church.
So that implies that you're dealing with demons or entities from another realm. If the Bible or religious texts or even prayer could have some effect over these voices, I mean, that takes it as far away from psychiatry's explanation as you could possibly go, doesn't it?
Yes, it sure does. And you wouldn't expect a hallucination to have any kind of reaction to religiosity. Why would a hallucination care about that?
Yeah.
But one of the things that really struck me strange is I started having patients come in saying when they repeated the 23rd Psalm, the voices went nuts. Two or three of them told me it was like throwing worms onto a hot frying pan. That's how the voices reacted to the 23rd Psalm.
Why do you think the 23rd Psalm would have such an effect? I mean, because that's got that great line, isn't it? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadows of death, I will fear no evil, for you
and
are
that's
with
it
me.
right there. That's it right there, because these things want the patient to fear them. Because what they do is they're energetic parasites. They inject thoughts into their minds that are negative, fearful, anxious, provoking, and then they feed off of that negative emotional energy. So a pattern that you'll find with schizophrenics, and don't take my word for it, it's out there. Just go look. Anybody who's working with schizophrenics, after the voices attack, they are completely drained. They don't have any energy. A lot of them can't even get out of bed. And I thought for years that this was due to the anxiety provoked by these nasty voices telling them to kill themselves or kill other people or do this kind of stuff. Or, and then one day a situation happened in the prison where a fella who had snitched off the gangs was put into the jail for the prison. So I always found myself over the worst units, the most violent ones, which was okay with me because I was an adrenaline junkie. But he was locked in the cell with a flaming florid psychotic who was unmedicated. And the gangsters were after the first guy because he had snitched off a gang, a drug deal. So they were trying to kill him. They wanted him dead so bad that they actually got guys that got in trouble so they could get thrown into the central detention unit so they would have a chance to kill this guy. So he's already been stabbed once. He was in there for protective custody. So they were 2-room cells, and the guy that they put in with him was a florid psychotic, unmedicated. And at 3 a.m, he's standing above this guy's bed, just staring down at him. Just staring at him. He wakes up and here's this guy staring at him, who's pacing the cell and speaking to voices and acting weird, and it's totally out of it. So I go to my office first thing in the morning, and here's a letter from that guy, the guy who snitched off the drug cartels in the prison, saying, you got to do something with this guy. He's driving me nuts. I got to get out of here. And then there was also a memo from the captain of the central detention unit saying, you need to come down and take a look at this psychotic guy in the cell with this guy. So they were both in the same cell. It was a perfect experimental situation. So they were under the same conditions, with the same staff, with the same food. I mean, everything else was negated except for their 2 conditions. And I went over to look at them, and I was watching them as they come up the step. I talked to the guy who the gangsters were trying to kill first. And he told me this guy's pacing the stage. He's crazy. He's talking to himself. He's saying nonsensical things. He's threatening me. I can't handle this. And the gangsters were threatening him also. They were throwing these notes under his door saying, we're here. As soon as we get a chance, you're dead. We're here. We're in the cells right across from you. So apparently it was a big drug deal, and they were pissed. They wanted this guy taken out. They'd already stabbed him once, which is why they put him in protective custody. So I was thinking he was a snitch. So I was thinking that the reason that schizophrenics were drained after the voices attacked is because it was so negative and so intense and so awful. But if that were the case, this guy who the gangsters were trying to kill should also be drained.
Yeah.
Because outside of war, it doesn't get any worse than that. Locked in a tiny cell with a flaming schizophrenic who probably hurt somebody in the past, with gangsters outside your door threatening to kill you if you come out. It doesn't get worse than that. So I looked at him and watched him as he came up the steps, and he had plenty of energy. He just bounded up the steps. He didn't even have to use the guardrails. He came in. He was nervous. He was agitated. He was paranoid, but he had plenty of energy. He wasn't drained. He was scared and somewhat depressed, but he wasn't wiped out. I mean, his flow of speech was coherent. It was quick. It was energetic. He had plenty of energy. So sent him back and brought up the schizophrenic guy, and he could barely make it up the steps. He was grabbing on the handrail. He was struggling to get up the steps. He came in, he slouched down in the chair, and he's like, no energy. He was depressed.
Is this due to the episode that has happened in terms of he'd had a psychic parasitical attack, and they had created all this negative energy, and that's the food for them to feed from? Is that what you...
Well, so that knocked out my... Yep. That's what it came down to, because for years I thought it was the anxiety of what the voices were telling him, because they never told him anything good. Kill yourself, kill somebody else. This guy's after you. It's nothing good. But in this case, this other guy should have been drained also, but he wasn't.
Yeah.
So I left that. I left the central detention unit going, that theory's wrong. Yeah. That theory's wrong. Something else is going on.
Do you remember that
here
as well, quite
vividly?
Yep.
And I didn't know what was going on, but I knew it wasn't the anxiety. So again, I started asking them questions, and it was like, after the voices attack, are you drained? Yes. It was like 100%. Almost every single one would say, after the voices attack, I was drained. So what I did is I got a scale, 1 to 10. How much energy do you have before the voices attack? How much energy do you have after the voices attack? So I give it to them, and there was a marked difference between the two.
So they come in waves. With the attacks come in waves. It's not consistent 24/7.
Well, some of them it is.
Feed.
With some of them it is consistent, and they're drained all the time. They're hearing the voices 24 hours a day. With others, they come in spurts. They come in when something goes wrong. They're right there to feed on it, to flame it up. They come after sunset, which is interesting. They get louder after sunset. They get louder about 3 in the morning.
It's like vampires, isn't it? Literally, when the sunlight comes up, it burns and kills them. There's a lot of truth in the fiction of Dracula with this story.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's where probably the subconscious came from with Dracula, because these things are feeding not only off them, but all of us.
Yeah.
Every time you can do the strength testing stuff. I think we talked about that, right? Where you get a negative thought in your head and try to hold your arm up, and it won't stay. So they're being drained, and they don't know it. So you ask them. And I started asking them again, because I knew they had the answers somewhere. And I didn't get any answers in school. I didn't get any answers in undergraduate. I didn't get any answers in master's program. I didn't get any answers in the doctorate program. They didn't have any answers. They had.
Did this become an obsession for you in your career at the time? Is this something that you were?
Well, it kind of was, and and I'd get sick of it. It's like having this giant puzzle.
Yeah.
And you're working on it for years, and you got sections of it together, but you can't find the rest, and you can't find the other pieces, and you go, well, there are no other pieces. I quit. And then I'd walk away, and I don't want to deal with psychotics anymore, and I'll go deal with drug addicts. And then it's like some big hand went out and grabbed me again. Okay, you spent your time with the drug addicts. Get back in here with the psychotics. And the next job would open up, and there they would be again. And I'd pick up right where I left off, because there was nothing else to do, other than investigate this. So it was clear that they were being drained. And you'd ask them, okay, every time that voices come, you're drained. You don't have any energy after they leave. Where's your energy going? What their answer was? I don't know. And then I'd say, well, if you have a raging fire in front of you, and you put your hand in that fire, and every time you stick your hand in the fire, you get burned. What's burning you?
Yeah.
Well, the fire. They know that. And I'd say, well, okay, if you've heard the voices 10,000 times over 20 years, and every time you heard the voices, your energy level drops to zero, where's your energy
What
going?
could it be? Yeah.
What could it be? And they'd go, I don't know. They were being blocked from seeing that. They couldn't make that correlation. And I'm like, that's odd, because they could make the fire correlation. They could make other correlations, but they couldn't make that one.
Mm.
You know, so the question became, what is blocking them from understanding this? You know, it's pretty clear they can understand these others, but they can't understand that one. There's something blocking it. So we started off with the traits. Do you want to go back to the traits? Or,
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So anti-religious. I mean, they don't want anything to do with religion, the Bible, preachers. They hate preachers. They don't want the guy going to church. They don't want him reading the Bible. And why would a hallucination do that?
Mm-hmm.
Now, and you guys who are working with schizophrenic, check it out yourself. I mean, all this is right in your face. It's right in your friggin' face. Just open your eyes and look at it. If they're running patterns, they cannot be hallucinations, as psychiatry is telling you. That's a fable. It's more of their bunk. Mm-hmm. You know, take these medicines. We're making a fortune off of these. Just keep telling there is no other treatment. It all has to be drugs. So
I mean, the political implications of what would happen if they did accept what the voices could possibly be are huge. I mean, maybe there is a reason for them to say, no, we don't want to go down that route.
Well, yeah. But, you know, if you look at both psychiatry and psychology, there's no spirituality to it at all.
No.
You know, it's completely devoid of any kind of spirituality. While I was in graduate school, I had to read other books just to feed my soul. It was like being in the Sahara Desert. It was all ego stuff. You know, it was the complete.
What's interesting for me is that psychiatry is a relatively modern invention. Yeah, Freud being the great gatekeeper of the early
about
days.
150 years, maybe something like that.
So previous to the introduction of psychiatry to this realm, is that the Catholic Church, generally speaking, would deal with people like this and say they were possessed by demons and have exorcisms. You know, they would have spiritual exorcisms which would cast out, you know, the demons from these people, like Jesus did in his ministry 25 times. You know, that
right.
Cast out.
So isn't that strange?
It seems as if with the decline of the influence of the church and the rise in the influence of psychiatry, is that the problem isn't being resolved anymore as it was spiritually. It's now just being used, you know, a chemical kosh is being used to knock these people out and not solve the problem. I mean, do you think that's part of the issue here? Is it on a meta level?
Yeah, it's a big part of the issue. All you know, they're performing chemical lobotomies on these people. You know, they're filling them full of drugs. It's a control issue. Yeah. You know, they're not trying to help these people get better. They're just drugging them down. And they're being taught in the medical schools and psychiatry that there is no other solution. You know, there is no other solution because they're not looking for one. You look at the funding that the National Institute of Mental Health has given for psychiatric research in schizophrenia. They've manipulated the numbers to where their funding is now down in the dumps. They do not want an answer. They're making, the psychiatrists and Big Pharma are making trillions of dollars. I think it's $234 billion a year between their psychiatric services and these toxic medications they're dishing out. They're after the money and control. They're not after people getting better.
That's right across the board. It's not just psychiatry, is it? It's also, you know, with other areas of big pharma and cancer and, you know, COVID. They don't want people being cured because, you know, that's the what is it? The first disaster of medicine is someone dying. The second disaster is someone being cured. You know, because they're no longer a consumer of their product anymore.
Exactly. They don't make money with them being cured. And schizophrenics are perfect. Oh, you got to take these drugs for the rest of your life. That's what they're told. Oh, you have a chemical brain imbalance, which, you know, they're totally clueless. That's what they've been taught in graduate school. They don't question anything. And they're not allowed to. I remember when I was in a doctoral program after 7 years in the on the front lines, I go, hey, well, wait a minute. It doesn't work like that. It works like this. This is what. Oh, don't you ask? Don't you question me? You know,
well, we're told, aren't we, to trust the science, but yet there is no science to support.
There is no science. No.
The argument.
No.
There's no evidence, is there? You know, it's just
there's
trust
no
me,
science.
I'm a doctor. You know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And a quasi doctor in this case. So you know, these voices, they foster and create negative emotion. Okay, so they do to us what we do to cows. You know, they put them out in the field. They eat the grass. They bring them in. They isolate them and they milk them. And that's exactly what these schizophrenic voices do to the schizophrenics. You know, they generate the energy. They can't produce their own energy. They can't produce their own emotional energy, just like we can't produce our own milk. So they have to drain it from these people. And it's not just the schizophrenics that are being drained. They're like the milk cows for these things, but they're hitting all of us. And you know yourself, I mean, you can walk down the street and all of a sudden here comes this horrible thought, just barges into your head out of nowhere. Well, why don't you just, you know, beat the crap out of that guy? You know, then you go, well, where'd that come from? Or why don't you just, you know, hit him in the head with a metal bar? And it's something you would never do. You wouldn't even consider on your own. But just the thought of it upsets you. Yeah. You know, where did that thought come from? So here you are looking at the thoughts again. So it's
like a thought stream, isn't it? It's like a river of thoughts.
It's a river of thought. And they don't ever ask where that river of thought comes from. A lot of it comes from your learning. You know, what you've learned, it's like your story, your experiences with life. But here's all this other stuff coming in from all these other sources. Also, you are the one who's back there listening to all this. You know, you're not that voice in your head that is constantly telling you this.
Do you choose what thoughts to entertain, to accept, to believe, to act upon? It becomes a free will choice. No?
Well, it's a free will choice at that point. If you realize that you're the chooser. Yeah. But they're not teaching that. They're saying these thoughts are your own. They belong to you. You know, from the time you were able to think, those are your thoughts. You know, you own them. That's not the case.
Because that's one of the goals of meditation and prayer, isn't it? Is to empty your mind of thoughts.
Right.
And it takes years to be able to achieve that enlightened goal because, you know, the river of thought has been dammed, as it were.
Yeah, it is. And you realize when you start, if you just sit there and you go, I'm going to wait for my next thought to come, they don't come. You know, you can sit there and wait, it's not thought. Then you start getting images. So it's like whatever this voice is in there, it wants control, just like it wants control with the schizophrenics. You know, you try to control it, it doesn't like it. But you have this other side there, which is feeling and intuition. It's that listener in your head that listens to these thoughts. And notice how many of those thoughts are lies. Oh, you have to worry about this, or what's going to happen here, or a vast number of it is just nonsense. It's just nonsense that you're listening to. Part of you who's listening, that part that is you, is taking advantage of. So it's like, how many times have you done something that you didn't really want to do because that voice in your head is telling you that you need to do it?
In the sense that the voices, the entities, whatever it is that's doing this is trying to influence your thought stream with negative thought patterns in order to be able to feed from them, which is why they are anti-religious in a sense, because religion and spirituality generally create positive thoughts and positive thought streams, which would drown out and extinguish the negative ones. Is that where this competition, as it were, comes from?
That's exactly right. You know, so you're the chooser. You know, so what happens with schizophrenics is they get unbalanced and they start listening to the negative. So it's like at a certain point you start losing control. With us, a negative thought comes in our head. Hey, smack that guy upside the head. You know, well, I'm not going to do that. You know, where'd that thought come from? And you just go, well, get out of my head. You know, and you don't do it. But schizophrenics, they're constantly being bombarded by these thoughts, and these thoughts are talking back to them just like your thoughts in your head are, also. And they're saying, do this, do that. You ask them,
they talk to them in the same voice as your voice? Is it the same?
Yeah, that's one thing that's really strange.
Same accent, you know, or is it a different voice? You know,
there was one time, and this was at the state hospital, where, I mean, there's a long story behind it, where I actually prayed to hear these things so I could sense what they were like, because I'd never heard them myself. And they came on, they tried to kill me in a certain situation. I mean, they were telling me to do things so where if I did them, I knew I wouldn't survive. But what surprised me is that these voices sounded just like all the other thoughts that go through my head, all the other thousands of thoughts that go through my head every day. But the intent was way different.
Mm.
There was no change in tenor or bass or inflection or anything. It sounded just like all the rest of my thoughts.
Yeah.
But the intent was far different from anything that I would do.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it very difficult to pick these things out. You know, especially if you were hearing negative thoughts all your life. You know, it's like it's just this background noise constantly.
Well, I like the idea of calling them psychic parasites, because there's a lot of research at the moment regarding how dangerous physical parasites are. And maybe connected to COVID and cancer and other things. Amazing area of research, which led me to you in the first place. But that's another conversation for another time. But one of the things that really blew my mind when I was looking into the parasitic world was, have you heard of Toxoplasmosis gondii, which is like a specific parasite which lives in the belly of a cat, right? But in order for it to sexually reproduce, the cat puts it out through its feces, and then rats will eat the feces, and the parasite will be able to change the chemical structure of the rat brain in order for it to be attracted to cat urine, which normally it's repelled by it because it's a dangerous thing for the rat. But once the Toxoplasmosis gondii parasite has entered into the rat, voices in the head of the rat tell it to be attracted to the cat urine, which is extremely risky, which leads to cats catching rats and eating them, putting the parasite back into the belly of the cat. It's like a cycle. And we can be infected with Toxoplasmosis gondii. So I'm wondering if there is a connection between.
Well, Andrew Weil says
that these psychic ones,
Yeah, Andrew Kaufman says there is, and he's kind of like a outer fringe psychiatrist, one of the few that I keep contact with. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he said there is a relationship between physical parasites and mental parasites. But wow. the voices are just like you said. It's like you throw blood in the ocean and it attracts sharks.
Yeah.
So this negative thought stream attracts more negativity. What you have is a split. Now, that's probably the only thing that psychiatry got right. Schizophrenia means split mind.
Yeah.
So what you have is the original personality that was there, and then you have these voices who are trying to take over that personality. And I don't know how many times I've had patients ask the voices, "Who are you?" And they would say, "We are you.
We are Legion.
Are you?" So they want you to think that you are them. And what we're taught from the time we're children is that all thoughts in our head are ours. So when these guys jump in there and they start telling you, well, skin that cat or poison that cat or torture that dog, or, you think that's you doing it. So we all think that our thoughts are ours. The first thing that has to be done is you have to realize that you're the listener of these thoughts. You're the one who's listening to this constant garbage that is talking in your head. You're the one that's really picking which thoughts to attend to, and which thoughts to attend to, and which thoughts to act upon. So most of those thoughts are lies, and most of the things that schizophrenics are told by their voices, virtually all of them are lies. So once they realize that these things are liars, they start losing their grip. In order for a lie to have any substance, you have to believe it. If you don't believe it any longer, it vanishes. Now, the truth will stay. The truth will be retained. Like the voices are entities. That is the truth. Whether psychiatry acknowledges it or not, it's still the truth. It may take them another 200 years to discover that at the rate they're going. But that's the truth. It's not going anywhere. It's not going to change. Mm-hmm. But the lies that are told schizophrenics, that's where the That's a Lie program comes in on our website. Once you start using that and you realize that they're lies and you call it a lie, that destroys their grip. Because you have to believe the lie for it to have a effect upon you. And it whether it's the truth or the lie, they want these negative thoughts to be acted upon to generate that negative emotional energy. And it's just as easy for them to tell you a lie to generate that, like, oh, the cops are after you, or these gangsters are trying to kill you, or the prison is full of paranoia. I mean, it's a very paranoid place.
What do you think they are? I mean, what's your best guess or your best description of what these voices are?
Well, they're negative entities. They're around us all the time.
Well, in
they're
what
attractive.
realm?
Well, they're around you right now.
But in an alternate universe, different
Well,
dimension.
It is an alternate.
The infinite unconscious, that the other side of the mind that you access when you do hypnosis, etc., etc. I mean, what would you describe?
Well,
how would you describe them?
Well, they're kind of like evil ghosts.
Yeah.
They're in another dimension, but that dimension interacts with ours. So
do you think that there used to be humans that lived on Earth that died and didn't go to heaven?
I think a lot of them were. Yeah. That they were evil, nasty thing that came back or never left this dimension. They never left this planet. They're still here roaming around. What's interesting is that, and I started experimenting with this later on when I was doing therapy, is that if you imagine, one of the things I needed to do when I was working in the emergency rooms, okay, they didn't want you doing any kind of therapy in there. They wanted you to either put the person into the psych hospital or get him out of the emergency room or send him to somewhere else. Just get him out of there, because the doctors had no idea how to deal with these guys or what to do with them.
Was that your job? Was that your job to process?
That was my job.
The psych emergency, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So they'd come in the ER and we'd make the decision. You either put him in the hospital or send him to the mental health center, release him to his family. Is he going to kill himself? Is he suicidal? All those kind of things. And a lot of times they'd come in saying they were, especially in the winter when the weather was bad, they'd come in going, I'm going to kill myself, because they wanted to get out of the cold weather. So that became a pain. But the ones that came in who were psychotic, who didn't need to be hospitalized, I'd like to give them information that would help them when they got out. And to realize
about your discovery about the voices.
Right. But I had to be very careful that they didn't go back and tell psychiatry or tell their family. So I had to be very careful about what I were giving them. And in order to do that, before they were medicated, the voices were a lot of times so loud, you had to get through them first. And the voices didn't like what I was telling these people, so they would get louder, and they would run a certain progression. They would first tell them, this guy's crazy, he's stupid, don't listen to anything he has to say. He's nuts. If they stayed there, because I would tell them some of what I knew about the voices, and they would go, well, hey, wait a second, this guy's different than the other psychs. He knows something, and I want to know what it is. So they stay around. So then the voices would say, okay, get out of there. Get out of his office, escape the emergency room, run, go to the bathroom, just get out. And in the prison, the third thing they would say is attack him. And that would roll off like it was like a fixed action pattern almost. So what I noticed on that, and I would tell these guys that certain specific ones, when I was going to tell them, they don't want the people to know that they're parasites. That's the last thing they want them to know. Because if you had a parasite on your arm, a big leech or something, you're looking down at it, you're not going to let it stay there. You're going to do something about it.
A tapeworm can live with you for years, and for the reason being is that it doesn't go detected. You don't know you've got it, and it uses camouflage and concealment to hide.
And that's the exact same. That's the exact same thing these things do. They camouflage themselves in your mind. It's like a tiger in the jungle, in that jungle of thought in there. And they come out at times and they inject all these negative thoughts in there, and they inflame everything. And if they're caught, they don't like it. And there were several times where the voices would tell the patient, hey, he knows about us, or hey, the jig's up, or he got us, and they're shocked. They're shocked that know.
So
about
is that one of the remedies for people who are suffering with this affliction? Is that once they become aware that the voices are not theirs, not in their head. They're actually parasites. Like any other parasite, can be evicted as much as they have tried to take possession. Is that one of the key remedies?
That's one of the key things.
People?
They have to understand that those thoughts are not theirs. They don't belong to them.
Yeah.
They belong to another entity, and that entity is a parasite. It feeds off the negative emotional energy that it injects those thoughts into their minds. And one thing that's real strange too is they have access to all your thoughts, all the patient's thoughts. They have all the negative things they've ever done. It can go in there and it can pull them up and bring them to consciousness and rub it in their face. So
that's dark, man.
It's real dark.
Where are they? Because I'm drawn back to the toxoplasmosis gondii parasite, which is just a single cell parasite. It's just a single cell, but yet it has the ability to go into the mind of the rat and change its behavior. How is a single cell parasite? What's the mechanism for that to be able to get inside the mind of a rat to control its behavior? So for me, it's like, okay, well, if these voices have got access to memory, where are the memory banks? I mean, is it like the Ashkarkic records where everything that's ever happened and everything that ever will happen is stored in a memory bank, and that's available for yourself?
Well, it's your personal memory, bank.
Yeah.
And some of the darkest, I mean, I've seen this twice, is where an abused woman, just tortured by a father or a husband or something for years and years and years. Okay, they started, the guy finally died, and here they're at the funeral, and here's the guy's body up there, and then all of a sudden they hear this voice in their head that sounds just like the dead guy who's been torturing them all their lives, and it comes back and it says, "You're not rid of me yet."
Oh God!
You remember when we did this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, which is, nobody knows about that stuff except them and the dead guy. So here they've convinced the victim that they're not dead. That guy isn't dead. He's now plaguing them from beyond the grave.
But do you think there's a possibility that the entity that was plaguing him in the physical world actually just jumped host? So it wasn't actually her father, abusing her or whatever it is. It was the entity that had possessed that human host that had hopped over to a new host. Because did these entities actually die?
That's an interesting idea.
When the host dies? Yeah.
I don't know. It's quite possibly because here they are pulling out all this bad stuff that, like they might have raped the woman or something. Hey, man, remember when I raped you and beat you and da-da-da. Who else would know that? Beside the dead guy. And then that voice is in their head pulling up all this stuff. I've had other patients that one guy owed like $0.10 to somebody years ago. And here's the voice saying, "You didn't pay that guy the dime. You didn't pay him his dime." and then I've heard this a couple of times too, where the voices say, "If you poke out your eye, we'll leave you alone. We'll go. We won't bother you anymore." The guy pokes out his eye and the voices come back laughing at him like, "See how stupid you are?"
I have a question about, suicide, which you talked about earlier, that paranoid schizophrenics have a much higher incidence of suicide. Now, the question is, are the voices driving the host to suicide in order to enjoy some evil satisfaction, or is the victim driven to suicide as the only solution to resolving these thoughts in the head? What are your
Well, I think it's a little bit of all those things, because they go to psychiatry and they get drugged up and it doesn't get rid of the voices. Now they're drugged up, they're zombies, and they're still hearing the voices. They still can't sleep. Their life is miserable. They can't function. The voices are at them 24 hours a day. It's like hell on earth. And they're thinking the only way to get out of this is to kill myself.
Yeah.
The other thing is that
because why would they kill the host?
That's another question. That's another question I had. And I've seen a couple of cases where the voices, when the guy's about to kill himself, they actually stop him. But that's not very often, But the other thing is, it takes a lot of guts and agony to kill yourself. So while you're contemplating it, there's a lot of paranoia and fear and desperation and anger and all this stuff, this turmoil of negativity. Like, how am I going to do it? And what's going to happen to my family? And da 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 da. So you got all this negative emotional energy just flowing out that these things are consuming. And the last question is, why are they cutting off their energy supply? What I've been told by some of them is that they're assigned to that person to make that person miserable and to destroy that person.
Like
an
opposite of a guardian angel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are guardian angels out there. I mean, everybody's got at least 2 of them.
So why aren't they protecting their human shard?
They try, but you have to ask them. They're not allowed to interfere with your free will, like these negative ones.
Is this where Psalm 23 would come in? Because it's, in a way, you're asking your guardian angel or whatever entity it is that's there to protect you to fight back against this negative force.
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. So they don't want you. They don't want you on any kind of positive spiritual path. They don't want you reading anything positive. They don't want you happy. They don't want you laughing. They hate kids for some reason. They just hate kids. So when I got one into the ER at a psychotic mother, I'd be real careful with trying to make sure that she's being watched after real careful. And you watch what's going on with these child molesters today. The child trafficking. At our border now, there's thousands of kids disappearing from that border. They're just vanishing. This is the biggest.
It's all allowed by the corrupt, deviant leadership, isn't it?
Yes.
Top down. It's not. It's not bottom up. It's top down. So, which makes me think that there's some high functioning,
they're
psychopathic, schizophrenic, people at the top who are indulging in this, cultural negativity that they're maybe feeding off as a big feeding frenzy. But anyway, this is all pretty heavy, dark stuff, right?
Yeah.
How can we switch this to something more positive? What are the solutions out there? How can people help themselves? How do you help people? Tell me about your book, because that has It's a Light program in, I imagine. And is that offering people who think that they may be troubled or have the affliction?
This is the first thing. This is the first thing I would go after. It kind of tells you what the voices are and how they operate. So you have to understand that these things are thought forms. They're energetic thought forms, and they're feeding off of you. That's the first thing that has to be understood, and that they can be blocked and they can be. You virtually have to starve them out. Now, these exorcisms, if you look at these things like your brain is a radio, okay, and you have all these frequencies that you can turn to and listen to. The gangsters are listening to the gangster frequency, and the doctors are listening to the doctor frequency. They're all different frequencies. The schizophrenics are at a very low frequency. So you have to change that frequency to change the behavior. So even if you shut the radio off, as soon as you turn it back on again, it's going to be set at that same frequency. So that's what the psychiatrists are doing. They try to shut off the radio by toxifying the brain so it can't think, and these major tranquilizers are there like but soon as that wears off, their patient's still at the same frequency. The same thing with exorcism. They can go in and they can drive out these things temporarily, but if that person doesn't get on a positive spiritual path and start moving up that path and stay there, these things are going to come back with much more force.
Did you see any exorcisms during your career? Because there's two quite famous ones that I've seen a lot of videos on. One is Father Lampert and the other is Father Rippiger, two Catholic priests who are specialists at exorcisms and practice a lot. And there's also Derek Prince, who was a Pentecostal exorcist, which is quite rare in the Protestant denomination. I mean, did you ever come across any of these things during your time? Were priests ever called in?
I worked with one in the prison who was kind of like a closet exorcist. He didn't want anybody to know that he was. But his patients would come and they would talk to me. the people he was working with. And then I forged a link with him. So we would work together on some of these guys, where he would do that part and do the prayers and that kind of stuff. And they don't like prayers. They don't like, so basically you do the opposite of all the things these things are telling them to do. Negative emotion. That's what they want most. They want to trigger that negative emotional energy, which they feed off of. They could care less about you. They energetically drain their victims like parasites. They get louder after sunset. Soon as the sun goes down, they get louder. And when I was working with psychiatry in the old folks' home, where they call it sundowner syndrome. Soon as the sun goes down, they got more animated, more troublesome, cause more problems. They get louder when ignored. So psychiatry will tell the patients, oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations. They're nothing. You can't do that. And you can check this out with any schizophrenic patient. You try to ignore them, they get louder. They will not be ignored. They demand attention. So they're after your attention constantly. They foster self-destructive behavior. They're always telling you to do things that are against your own benefit. Something that's going to hurt you or destroy you or convince you you're not good. They say things like you're stupid, you're ugly, you can't succeed at this, you can't succeed at that. This guy's talking behind your back. It's all that kind of stuff. They're constantly filling your head with that kind of stuff. They foster isolation, just like these bozos are doing right now with their virus. They want you isolated. They don't want people getting together. They don't want them having a good time. They want them isolated and alone, so they just can pick on them by themselves. That's why a lot of schizophrenics will lock themselves in the bedroom. They won't come out. They demand the attention of their victims. You can try to do something else, but they're right there. They're after your attention. They want that. They want to hook it. They're like fishermen. They bait the hook with something that they think they'll get you with. They'll throw it out, see if you bite on it. If you bite on it, then you go, oh my God, this horrible thing. And then you start thinking about that and they got you. So they try to keep you fixated on a negative thought or a negative emotion or a negative habit. They're constantly maneuvering for increased control over the victim until the victim has no control and they end up in a psychiatric prison hospital somewhere. Those are the guys that need to be in prison. They're constantly gaslighting the victim. I remember one patient, they convinced him that he had murdered somebody and that he hadn't been caught. So he's thinking, well, should I go to the police department and tell them that I murdered somebody when I'm not sure I murdered somebody, or should I hide from the police? So he's like in a catch-22, both ways generating a massive amount of negative emotional energy. No matter what he does, they manipulate perception. So how many times have you gone like, well, what did he mean by that? Or what did I say that offended this guy? And then here comes this thought, well, you could have done this, or you could have said this, or, so they manipulate your perception of situations. So it's the most negative perception possible. And then they feed off of that negative energy. They have complete access to your memory. They demand that you not tell anybody about their presence. So the voices tell the schizophrenic, don't tell anybody about us. They'll lock you up. They'll think you're crazy.
Well,
and it is true. It is true.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that one, I think.
Yeah, one thing's interesting. I found that most of the time they kind of hypnotize the patient into this mind thing where you get fixated on a negative thought, and then it just carries on. And most of these schizophrenics have been hearing these voices for decades. So they're used to them. They just come on. They don't even realize they're there until they get to a certain degree. But what I teach patients in my practice is the things to do to counter them. And one of the things to break that hypnotism is to snap a rubber band on your wrist. Okay, now that'll shut them up, because in most cases it stuns them and hurts them more than it hurts the patient. I've only had one voice come back and go, you think that affects us? You're stupid. The rest, it would shut them up for a period of time. And then they could start into the exercises that I give them in clinical practice. The 23rd Psalm is one of those things. Repeat the 23rd Psalm. That's like punching them in the face. They hate that. They're consummate liars. You can't believe anything they say. They lie about everything. And they'll try to bargain with the patient. You do this and we'll go away, or you just have one drink, it'll be okay, or just have, take one shot of meth and everything will be fine. They lie about everything. You can't make any bargains with them because you can't trust them to carry through with anything except stuff that's going to get you in trouble. All the time in the prison, the voices would tell prisoners where to be at what time to get more meth when they needed it. And I talked to scores of inmates who listened to the voices. They showed up at the place they were told to be, and somebody would appear out of nowhere with the meth. It's strange. They would tell them which houses to rob and what time to break in there, and generally where the loot was. They would tell them if the owner of the house was up, and where to run to, where to hide. I mean, so they're giving them all these directions. And for a drug addict to be able to rob people and to get an unlimited supply of drugs, for them, that's like heaven.
Yeah. But they open the floodgates, don't they? They open the doors then and say, you guys come in.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah. We love it, man. I'll stay high for the rest of my life. They consistently steer the voices away from anything that might generate joy or happiness. They don't want you to be happy. They don't want you to watch America's Funniest Videos. They don't want you to be satisfied with your life. They don't want you to be married. They go after marriages. They destroy marriages. They destroy relationships. But the thoughts they put in your head, these are all patterns.
But they sound like a list of mental illness conditions. So whereas we're thinking, this is just a symptom of a mental illness or a depression or PTSD or whatever it may be, but in reality, it could be part of what you're talking about here is that it's low level influence of your thoughts.
Well, yeah, it's like I said, it's a continuum. I mean, everybody has experienced most of these things.
Yeah,
it's just a matter of degree.
So when you're being negative about yourself, right? Because everyone does, occasionally go through a period where they're down and they feel negative. Is that you?
That's not you.
Is that you being negative? No. Okay.
It's not you.
Interesting.
No, any negative thought about yourself or anybody else.
I need to ring a priest. Yeah.
Yeah, it comes from them. I did something smashed myself with a hammer or something the other day, and I'm like, you stupid fool. And then I'm like, okay, that wasn't me. You have to keep on it. Any negative thought about yourself or anybody else comes from them because they want to foster this divisiveness, just like the deep state wants to foster divisiveness among us right now. They want us to fight. They can manipulate feeling without speaking. So, I don't know how many times I've sat there and then all of a sudden I just start feeling depressed for no reason whatsoever. And then I know, okay, one of them's got in there. They short circuit reason. They make things sound reasonable, but they're not. Boredom is bad. For a schizophrenic to be bored, to be locked up and isolated like they do, that's the very worst thing you could do for them. They need to be distracted because when they're bored, these things are feeding on them constantly. They have no respite from them. They try to pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim. So they want you to believe that they are you, that all these negative thoughts that you have about yourself, that you're stupid, you're ugly, that people are out after you, that you can't do anything right. They want you to believe that that is you who's telling you that. And if you believe it, it becomes true. It's a lie that you believe that becomes true. And you foster it with your faith. So once you give one of these lies that they put into your head, you believe it. You give it your faith, and it becomes true. Selective forgetting, we already talked about that. They can make you forget. Like the patients I work with, I'll give them a list of exercises that they need to do consistently. And if they don't write them down, they won't remember but two or three of them by the time they leave my office. So they go after this, and they'll make them forget to do those exercises. They'll distract them from reading the Bible or spiritual stuff. They don't want them moving. So it's the cartoon they had of devils on one shoulder and angels on the other. That's exactly what's going on in reality.
Mm.
You know, the devils are speaking in words. They're speaking through the voice in your head that's constantly telling you what to do. And the angels are more like feeling and intuition. You know, like you sense that something is wrong, or you sense that there's something wrong with this person, or you know enough to stay away from them. It's more feeling and intuition. They don't barge in and tell you what to do like these other ones do. So the voices are constantly trying to destroy your self-concept. They attempt to pull their victim away from consensual reality. So the reality that we believe in, they're constantly trying to pull the victim into this alternate reality that they've created. You know, that people are after you, or there's monsters out there, or that, you know, snakes are in your bed, or that, you know, something's watching you from the camera. It's this awful alternate reality. They use confusion as a means of instilling negative suggestions. So, you know, they'll get the schizophrenic real confused, and that's a very nasty state. People don't like to be confused. And then they'll say, okay, now go do this. And they start doing that, and all that confusion disappears. All right? So that's the same thing hypnotists use. Any attempt to inform the schizophrenic patient that the voices are energetic parasites and are draining them will trigger a volatile reaction by the voices consistently. You know, so when you go to tell them that these things are parasitic entities, they go nuts. They just explode. You know, so you can expect a thing from them, a very volatile negative reaction. So there's a lot of things you can do. One thing is to block them out. You know, you can't ignore them because they'll get stronger. You can't ignore them, but you can block them out.
As part of your clinical practice in helping people, you make them aware of all of those patterns, and then work on being able to block each of those patterns, either going in the opposite direction or other various methods and treatments of dealing with that. And once you've conquered those patterns, is that it? You know, you've extinguished the voices.
Well, you haven't extinguished it. You're just aware of the patterns they run.
Yeah.
Okay. To extinguish them, you have to starve them out and replace them. So it's like the radio, where you have to change the frequency. You know, you have to move away and block out. So if you're listening to acid rock, you know, and you're addicted to listening to acid rock, and you know the acid rock isn't good for you, you can't ignore it because you got to replace it. You know, so you got to block it out and replace it with something else. And that's where it doesn't have to be religion. It's just a positive spiritual path. So if there's these negative entities here, there's also positive entities. Everybody has at least 2 guardian angels watching over them at all times. I mean, I don't know how many times in the ER where it was very clear that these guardian angels saved the person's life. One lady, I remember one of the most dramatic ones, the voices were telling her to kill herself, or she lost her job. Her husband left her. She couldn't make the rent. Everything was going wrong in her life. So she decided she was going to go out to the railroad track, wait for the train to come by, drive in front of the train, and just off herself. So she drugged herself up. She was talking to her sister in San Diego, and the train was coming. She hung up. She started the car, and when the train was almost there, she drove her car right in front of the train. The train hit it, smashed it, threw it up over the train and into a second railroad track where another train was coming in the other direction, and hit it also.
Wow.
And threw it 50 yards off of the track. She was caught in that wrecked car. They had to cut her out of it. She couldn't get out. It was such a crumpled can, and all she had was a black eye and a bloody nose. You know, hit by 2 freight trains. And I asked her, I said, what were you thinking when you became conscious and you saw you were still alive? And she said, I was furious. She said, I was absolutely furious, you know, and she was really pissed. And then I said, well, what happened then? She said, well, I heard this voice saying, everything is going to be fine. Everything is going to be all right. Just, you know, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. She knew that was her guardian angel.
Yeah, if your number's not up, your number's not up.
Well, in these cases, but there were so many cases like that. I should have been keeping a log of them, but I didn't. It was like lobsters when they were so plentiful. They were with dog food. I mean, so many miraculous things. Another guy had .357 Magnum with all the cylinders loaded. Put it to his head, it would click. Put it to the floor, bang, blew a hole in the floor. Put it to his head, click, and put it to the floor, bang. And he goes, okay, I got it. Anymore. Another guy had a 45 automatic. He put it to his head and click. The next day he went out to the rifle range, put that same round in, and it went off. Story after story after story. One lady shot herself right in the heart, which she said was a .357 Magnum, and it missed all the crucial organs. It just went right through, went into the wall, went out the house. And here she is sitting here in front of me after shooting herself a few hours ago. She's got a big Band-Aid on either side, and she's like nothing happened.
So you retired from your career, and then you've set up a private practice now where you...
Well, I've only recently started that because, from these interviews, people would contact me, all the time. Can you help me? Can you help me? And, I was kind of burnt out. I was like, oh, man, it's like, 40 years of this and now more.
Just when I thought I was out, they pull you back in.
Yeah. So here it comes again. Oh, you think you're getting out, huh? No, you're not getting out. And then you got guys like you, like, hey, come out and tell us what you've learned. I can't not do that, So it's like, the big hand has got me back, throws me back in again. So a few months ago, Sherry, my cohort, that book wouldn't exist if it wasn't for her. I mean, she was like the bulldog that, I wrote most of it. She pushed it through. I mean, I couldn't have done it without her. She goes, well, you've got all these people writing you, asking for your help anyway. Why don't you just start up your practice again? And I go, I don't know about that. And so she said, you can just work with the people you want to, the people who are really motivated. And I go, well, that's okay. So that's okay. So she put up on my site, she put up a consult page on the site, and I can pick and choose. So what I got now is I work with one person a day on the days I'm not doing something else. The ones who aren't motivated, I'll drop and put somebody else in. And the ones that are working are doing good. So hopefully.
Are you getting some success from, getting rid of the voices in people's heads?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So George, if you go to my website and you look up the interviews with George Jagatic, he was a therapist who was working in a psychiatric hospital in New York and began using meth, and he got addicted to meth. He started seeing the shadow people and hearing voices. He knew what the voices were, but he didn't know what to do about them. So he wrote me, he says, hey, I was a therapist. I got strung on meth, and I contacted him. I said, okay, you know what they are. You're halfway there. So if you go to my site and you look at the interviews with George Jagatic,
have a look.
We've virtually got rid of all his voices now. He's back in control. He had a job. He's doing good. He's actually working with people himself now. And several in the prison. I got in trouble in the prison for helping prisoners because they would tell psychiatry, hey, I don't need any medicines anymore, I'm done. And what happened? Well, he helped us. Jerry helped us. So the chief psychologist found out about that. Instead of being happy, he put me under investigation. He had all these guys come down and ask all my
how did that feel? I mean, how did that feel? Because you had this breakthrough with these patients.
I was shocked.
Lives were immeasurably improved, and it was demoralizing.
I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. Because I was like, well, they don't have to pay for these expensive medicines anymore. These guys are better. They're not causing problems on the yard. They can go out and function in society now. The voices are gone. And here's the chief psychologist pacing around like some kind of demon, sending down other psychologists to investigate what I was doing in my sessions.
Wow.
But none of my patients would tell them anything. None of them. So he didn't have anything. So he calls this inquisition, where he drags me up in front of the medical director, accuses me of doing all this stuff, that was experimenting with prisoners, is what he accused me of doing, which I guess is what I was doing. I was asking him questions. Yeah, I was experimenting. What works and what doesn't work? Will this tactic work? How much does it work? Is this one better? What do you do? How do you fight these things? So I guess I was experimenting. But boy, he was trying to get me fired as fast as he possibly could. And then it came. what really torqued him off once was they had a valid MMPI on one patient that I was working with who had completely cleared, no more voices at all, went off his medications. He was doing great. His MMPI that he took when he got into prison, which is the gold standard for psychologists as far as measuring any kind of mental illness, showed that he was clearly psychotic. Okay, so after his stooge grilled this particular patient, and the patient said, "He's helping us, not like you, asshole," that flamed him. So then he said, "Well, would you be willing to take another MMPI?" Because they already had a valid one saying the guy was psychotic. So he gave the prisoner another MMPI, and he came out non-psychotic. The profile was valid, so it showed that something I was doing was actually getting rid of these things and helping these people. And then they went nuts. Then they really started going after me, you know, because that for them, that was proof that I was doing something that they didn't approve of. You know, that prison was a very dark place. There was no good deed went unpunished in that place. And that was one of the worst.
Okay, well, Jerry, I promised to keep it under 2 hours, and I think we're going to try and stick to it. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you about this subject, which is as vast. You know, it's just a bottomless subject that we could talk for days and days about, and I hope to be able to do that with you again. Maybe we can speak to some of the people that you've been working with.
We can bring Jenny or George on. You know, George is still. He's still fighting with the voices, but he's pretty much got them under control. So you were talking about a high functioning schizophrenic. George is one.
Okay. Well, until next time, Jerry. Thanks so much. And see you later. Bye.
All right. Take care.